My name is John McBratney. I'm the chair of the English department, and I'm actually substituting for Dr. Catherine Gatto, who is the chair and the director of the Women and Gender Studies program, which is the organization that's sponsoring this event. Unfortunately, Dr. Gatto is stuck in an airport in Charlotte. She was hoping to get here, but I'm not sure what happened. I think the weather happened, and she's not able to make it. The presentation that you're going to hear tonight is part of a lecture series sponsored by the Women and Gender Studies program, titled Women's Lives Yesterday and Today. And our speaker, who I'm going to introduce to you, is Dr. Chon Cottage, who is retired Vice President for Academic Affairs and Professor Emerita of English at Austen College. She earned her doctorate at Case Western Reserve in English and has taught for 18 years, is that right? Taught for 18 years at
Austen, right.
Both in the English department and the Austen Studies program. And I was amazed to read that she started an online course in 1996. This is eons ago in technological terms. So it's a remarkable innovation. Just say a little bit about Dr. Potus. Her main area of research interest is in the teaching of writing, and she has co-authored 3 textbooks on writing. The one that she says she's most proud of is the one she co-edited with her husband, Leonard Potus, titled Working with Student Writers, which went into its second edition in 2010. She's also published essays on writing in college English and college composition and communication, the leading journals in that field. She's also very interested in research in pedagogy. She's published several articles in that field, including The Rhetoric of Reproof, interesting title, and Pedagogical in Loco Parentis, published in 2008, and that led to another piece, The Value of Student Writing as Reading, published in 2012. She's going to be talking tonight, though, about a subject that comes out of a third research interest. This is far afield from writing or teaching pedagogy, and this is the world of Jane Austen, which is, for those of you who know Jane Austen, a universe in itself. This is a large and capacious field to which many have contributed. She is an active member of the local chapter of the Jane Austen Society of North America, which is huge. She was a keynote speaker at that local chapter meeting in June 2013. More than 100 people attended. That gives you some idea both of interest in Jane Austen and interest in what Dr. Potus has to say. She's also part of, and she's participated in, the national conference of the Jane Austen Society of North America. She is also, as part of a panel of Austen College speakers, done a TED Talk, is that right?
TEDx Talk, right.
It's going to be on the internet.
It's on YouTube. Yep.
The presentation is entitled Jane Austen, an 18th Century Woman of the 21st Century. She's also going to be teaching a course in the fall at Case Western Reserve for the Senior Scholars Program.
Yeah.
Also on Jane Austen, adaptations of Jane Austen in film. The talk that she's going to deliver tonight is titled The Sweetness of Her Temper. Welcome to Jane Austen's World. Yeah, that is the subtitle. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome, and I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Potus.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction and for serving as a last-minute substitute. Also, that was extremely generous of you to do that. I know it's a very busy time of the year, so I'd like to say, first of all, thanks to all of you for attending today. I also want to note that the Cavs playoff game is at 7 o'clock, and it takes me 10 minutes to get home. So that's our time frame. Just kidding, just kidding. I'll stay as long as you want. Yeah, I entitled this Welcome to Jane Austen's World as a subtitle because I know that this is a series on women's lives, correct? So I guess part of what I wanted to accomplish this afternoon was to give you all a sense of what it must have been like to live at the time and in the place that Jane Austen did. I think a lot of times people make a lot of assumptions, for instance, about English culture, even today. Well, you know, they speak English, we speak English, it must be the same, how different can it be? And I can assure you that it's very different. It's different in contemporary times, and it's extremely different if you are looking at the time frame within which Jane Austen wrote. And one thing I wanted to mention, we'll come back to this slide. Some of you may recognize it as coming from Being Jane, the film with Anne Hathaway. Have any of you seen any of the film adaptations of Austen? There's a ton of them out there. Yeah, over the last 20 years, there have been scads of them. This happens to be one. We'll come back to that. Jane Austen lived during a time period called the Regency. And I'm putting the dates up here because the dates are important. And I'm going to make a statement, and if anybody in the audience disagrees with it, please do speak up, because it might be just my own peculiarity in thinking this. But when I read American literature, I don't pay any attention to who the president is, like at the time that the literature was written. None. When I read British literature, I always, I right away think who is on the throne, and I don't know if it's just me, but I don't think so, okay? And one thing that you'll want to note here, George III was on the throne for 60 years. And again, if you're thinking of differences and contrasts, I mean, picture a U.S. president as president for 60 years. I mean, we can't even fathom that. I guess if it's somebody that you like, it would be a good thing. If it's somebody that you don't like, on the other hand, you're pretty well toast. And that's kind of what happened with George III, because by the time 1811 rolled around, he was pretty much gaga, and his son, the Prince Regent, ruled until 1820. By the time he became George IV in 1820, he was already getting up there, and he ruled only 10 years to 1830. Okay, so this is the time frame that we're talking about. And I always think of the current Queen, Elizabeth II, and Charles kind of perennially in waiting, waiting to be king and waiting and waiting. And her mother, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died a couple years ago, and maybe some of you know the exact age. I think she was like 102 or 103. So if I were Charles, personally, I would not be holding my breath. But he's been waiting a long time to be king. Okay, so what was Jane Austen's culture like at that time? I've got a few bullet points here that are all pretty important. They're pretty much self-explanatory, but I just want to focus on, in particular, the idea of the gentry and the final bullet point here, primogeniture. Jane Austen is not writing about royalty. She's not writing about dukes and earls and countesses. There is a countess in one of the novels, and she makes quite a splash because she is a countess, okay, and therefore is very different from the characters about which Austen is writing. There we go. She's writing about a very narrow slice of landed gentry, what we might call country squires. And the custom, not necessarily the law at the time that she's living, is that inheritance passed to the eldest son in the family and also passed through the male line. What that translated into then is if you were Sir somebody or another and you had 2 daughters and you had a brother who had a son, then your estate would pass to your nephew rather than passing to your daughters. Okay? And it's a lot more complicated than that, really, but in a nutshell, that's what primogeniture is. And Latin scholars here, yes? Anybody take Latin? Okay, primo, first, geniture, born. Firstborn inherits everything, and just add on there the firstborn male. So, and that becomes important. Issues of class are also extremely important in this culture in which Jane Austen is operating, because it was extremely, extremely rigid. Very little social mobility. You essentially were born into a particular class and died in it. There were very limited acceptable vocations for the male sons in the particular social class about which Austen writes. And I have the 2 most important ones listed. And notice that I have the caveat here. This is the younger son. If you were the older son, the oldest son in particular, then you were in like Flint. You got it all, the whole enchilada. If your father is Sir so-and-so, you become eventually Sir so-and-so. You own the estate, and your younger brothers have to pick. Now, I think you can probably see the sorts of issues that might come up if you were a young man born into this social class. You're not inheriting. You've got to do something, and you've only got a couple choices. And if you're going into the military, you're not going in as a private. You're not going in as infantry. You're going in as an officer. Okay? Can you see what abuses this might lead to, though? I mean, what's the qualification for being an officer? What's the qualification for being a minister? What's the qualification? Your birth. Yeah, birth order. Basically, it's totally random. You just happen to be born the second son rather than the first son, so boom, you're a clergyman, or poof, you're an officer. It's not anything to do with merit or any vocation, any religious feeling, nothing, none of that. It's just these are the only things that you can do because of your particular accident of birth, really. All right, what were specifically some of the women's issues? Women essentially had absolutely no legal identity. A woman couldn't sue anybody. A woman could not bring forward a divorce action. She could be divorced, but she could not do the divorcing. Certainly, there was no vote. Bless you. And in fact, and it's not like men had it so great either, because you had to own a certain amount of property in order to be able to vote. As I said, because the eldest son, firstborn son, inherited generally, the only way that a woman could inherit is if she were specifically provided for by a male relative. And you do see in Jane Austen's novels examples of very, very rich women indeed. And most of the time in Austen, these very, very rich women are using their wealth to manipulate other people to do what they want them to do. And they can do that because they have the power of money behind them. Probably all of you have either read or seen one or more film adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, yes? In that novel, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is the sort of dragon woman at the end of toward the end of the novel, who comes in and tries to break up, makes one last stab at breaking up Elizabeth and Darcy, and succeeds only in Elizabeth becoming, yet more inclined to do what Lady Catherine de Bourgh doesn't want her to do. She's a great example, but in nearly all the novels there's an example of a very wealthy woman who is using that wealth not for the greater good, but in order to manipulate. But all these women had to be specifically provided for by their male heirs. There are all sorts of spill-offs from this status too, or lack thereof. Women could not travel alone. Jane Austen spent a lot of her life traveling from either one cousin or one of her many siblings' homes. Not within a huge section of England, but she did a lot of traveling within a fairly small, part of the southeast of England. But she did all that traveling accompanied by others, none of it alone. And it wasn't necessarily travel that she would have chosen for herself, but travel that was selected for her by her mother or by a brother's invitation. And needless to say, there's a huge gulf between the gentlewomen and the working class. The estates, even the smaller estates, required a whole infrastructure of servants to run them. And that infrastructure is present, though very often not foregrounded in Jane Austen's novels. There are all kinds of nameless servants. One of the most interesting papers that my students wrote actually over the years was one that focused on the servants. And the student went through all 6 published novels and pulled out every single reference to a servant. And the vast majority of them were not even named. A couple of them were. But if you look closely enough in the novels, you can see that there are people that are making this whole operation work, but they largely are unnamed. And at that, they are living a much better life, these individuals who were domestics, than their counterparts in the city. I was just reading the other day in a New Yorker article, of all things, that in the late 18th century, the estimate is that 1 out of every 5 women living in London, which was the big city, and it was a big city even back then, 1 out of every 5 women is a prostitute. And it sounded to me like a pretty high percentage. I don't know, I have no clue what the percentage is in contemporary London, but I'm quite sure it's nowhere near 20%. Any questions? This is a small group. Please feel free to raise your hand or just blurt out if you want more information or want to make a comment. Yes.
So how do women's property being passed along?
If the woman was specifically provided for, then she could pass property to whomever she wanted. And the custom was to give it to the firstborn son. And you see that in a novel like Sense and Sensibility, for instance, where one of the characters' mothers has been provided for. She owns everything, and she has 2 sons. By custom, the elder of the 2 sons will get the inheritance, and that's her intention. It's pretty funny toward the end of the novel because she has a falling out with him over his choice of bride. So she says, okay, you're not my heir anymore. Now your brother's the heir. Then he elopes and she gets mad at him. So the comment in the novel is something like she started out with 2 sons, then she only had 1, then she had none, and she was basically removing the inheritance from each son as he displeased her. She winds up reconciling, by the end. But if the woman were specifically provided for, if it was her inheritance, she could give it to whomever she wished. But the custom was definitely to give it to the elder.
What happens if no son?
Then it goes through to the closest male relative. So it could be a cousin, it could be a nephew, it could be a second cousin, it could be a first cousin once removed. Basically, you look for the closest male heir. No problem. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned there was a primogeniture in this Regency era that you're talking about. How long did that continue?
Into the 20th century, basically. Officially? Pardon?
We saw Doc Debbie.
Yeah, right. And that brings up the issue of the entail. Very often, the estates were entailed, and that's what That's what it's called when there's no immediate male heir, there's no firstborn son, so then the estate is entailed on the closest male relative, which is what happens in Downton Abbey. So, and literally happened. And it's pretty crazy, though. The idea of primogeniture as a custom was not abolished until well into the 20th century. So, okay. Now, I got to tell you, when I look at this list, I would not have been a very accomplished 18th century gentlewoman, okay? Because basically the only thing that I can do really well here is bullet number 4. I'm very well educated, and I really like to read, and I really like to write, and that totally would have been a negative. Okay? Basically, you were to do what we would consider nothing at all. And you were expected to be able to draw, to paint, to play a musical instrument. You got trotted out in front of social groups to show that you could sing or that you could play your instrument. That was a very important part of being an attractive future spouse. The other thing, of course, you had to have was money. But even if you didn't have money, to have a fighting chance in the marriage market, you really needed to have some of these accomplishments. So I always sort of think about this and just chuckle, because I honestly don't know what they would have done with me, because I'm quite sure no matter how many drawing lessons I would have had, I would not have been able to draw, at least not well. Okay, in the novels, as you read them, and this I think can be somewhat confusing, just the way that women are named. The young daughters in a family will be ranked, again, by birth order. Birth order is extremely important, even if money isn't, hinging on it. So, in Sense and Sensibility, where we have the 3 daughters, the first one is always Miss Dashwood, and she'll be referred to as Miss Dashwood all the way through. And in our minds, we're like, what? There's 3 Miss Dashwoods, right? They're all Miss Dashwood. But they're not. They're Miss Marianne Dashwood, who is the second, and then Miss, what's the third daughter's name? Catherine, is it? She's hardly in the novel. She's in a couple of the film adaptations with a higher profile role. But anyway, Miss Margaret, not Catherine, Margaret. So it's Miss Dashwood, Miss Marianne Dashwood, and Miss Margaret. And that tells you immediately what this pecking order is in the family. Okay, so even though it doesn't have anything to do with money, it does have to do with position and status. This reminds me of dogs, where there's a pack, and you have to have the alpha clearly, and the alpha is always the oldest, whether it's female or male. Money is also, as I said, an extremely big deal in Jane Austen's novels, and it's an extremely big deal in her culture. I guess you could say it's an extremely big deal in our culture, right? So I'm not sure much has changed. But in terms of what is needed in order to be a gentleman, and obviously it's all in pounds, not dollars, right? When you're reading the novels or when you're watching the film adaptations, keeping in the back of your mind that roughly £1,000 is kind of a minimum, because £1,000 will get you a carriage, it'll get you a house in the country as well as a house in the city, and it'll get you servants. So that's kind of a ballpark figure that you keep in mind. And carriages then is now equal status. And most of the film adaptations do an extremely good job of showing visually what the status symbols are. Because if you take a better look at these carriages, you'll see, for instance, if one of the characters has a very large carriage that is pulled by, say, 4 horses, all 4 horses will look alike. And that's not by accident, okay? They're picked because they all look alike. You have a matched set. That's important. Your servants have livery that perhaps has the crest of the family on it. That's important. All these things are indicative of the status of the individuals. So basically £1,000 a year income is what you're looking at. And for the most part, the income, again, comes from the land, from your tenant farmers, from sale of the produce, livestock, whatever. It's based on the land. And then also the livings. And these livings are what the clergymen, what the ministers receive. And very often what these younger sons would do, because basically they're a younger son, so they're not inheriting, right? But they want to be gentlemen. So they're looking to cobble together at least £1,000 a year income. So what they might do, if they're very lucky, is scoop up a bunch of livings. Okay, so that if they have like £400 a year from one and £300 from another and a couple hundred for another, then they're getting closer to that £1,000 a year income that they need. You can imagine, though, again, the abuses that it led to, because it wasn't as easy to travel back then. So if these livings were maybe 10, 15, 20 miles apart, I mean, if somebody died in one parish at the same time that you were over in another, you weren't going to be able to turn right around and go and minister to your flock in that parish. So the abuse of these livings very often happened. Military service was another way of earning a gentleman's income. In the Navy, if you were the captain of a ship, if you were out on the high seas and you were sailing along and you spotted a ship flying the flag of a country that England was at war with, you could go over and you could fight with the other ship, you could capture it, and then you got to keep whatever was in the cargo. And if you were the captain, you got to keep most of it. So being in the Navy was a way of earning money too. And again, on shipboard, you had the same sort of rigid class structure. So the captain got most of the cargo that was captured, and then it went down from there, depending on the type of job that you performed on the ship, until you got to the lowest of the low, who maybe got a couple shillings or whatever. But if the ship was carrying a lot of cargo, gold, whatever, you got to keep it all. The other country, of course, would consider you a pirate at that point, but you didn't worry about that. Okay, any questions? Comments? Yes?
Just curious, how much is £1,000
Let me, yeah. I'm just checking here to see if I had the conversion, and I don't think I do. So I am sorry about that. We could probably Google it, pretty quickly. And there are websites that do the conversions. And John, can you come up with a number offhand? Because like Darcy in Pride and Prejudice probably has an income of, I'm going to say like a couple $100,000 a year, dollars. Yeah.
I just did it. It's
Good.
$1,492. Like in US dollars.
Oh, £1,000 now. Yeah, but back then it would have been, $1,400, $1,500 in 1800 would have been a lot of money. So what we need is a website that'll tell us 18th century dollars. But again, Darcy is a very, very rich man, and I'm going to say I read somewhere that his income equated to a couple $100,000. And in the novels, he has $10,000 per year. So this might have been $20,000, but again, that's a guess. We should verify.
It's probably a lot more than that, actually.
Probably, you think?
I was
Yeah.
thinking like 250,000.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
that's a wild.
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
But it's considerably.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a considerable amount of money.
Mm-hmm. And bear in mind that again, you're talking about just the gentry. The royals have way more money than that, and on the other hand, the servants have nothing. I mentioned the Prince Regent, who comes into power, if you will, in 1810. the whole time that he's been the Prince of Wales and the heir to the throne, he spends more on his racehorses in 1 year than the working class folks will earn in their entire lifetimes. Okay, so there's just a huge gulf between the rich and the poor, just enormous. And honestly, you can kind of see that today too, because the Crown owns an incredible amount of real estate. If you walk through London, you have no idea. Pretty much, wherever you're looking, the Queen owns it, and let alone all of the priceless artworks and everything else. And I think she's probably supposed to be the richest woman in the world, but she's way richer than you would imagine. You can't even put a price on it. And again, this is what it bought you, okay, that £1,000 a year. A lot of the, as I said, the film adaptations, I think, do a really good job of showing you visually what the house was like, because we think of a large house and we picture whatever we picture, but some of these country estates are absolutely mammoth, and even the ones that are not owned by dukes or earls or whatever. Okay, so you can have all of this if you are a gentleman. There are also two opposing philosophies in the 18th century and the start of the 19th, classicism and romanticism. Jane Austen states 1775 to 1817 straddle the century. More of her life is lived in the 18th than in the 19th, but just barely. Classicism, you probably know this, privileges reason, the head over the heart, order, rules, the welfare of the group over the welfare of the individual. Romanticism privileges much more the individual, the heart over the head, intuition over reason. Romanticism in the UK pretty much starts in 1798 with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads, and then goes on from there. And again, Jane Austen, born 1775. In Sense and Sensibility, sense essentially refers to the classical approach. Sensibility, which means sensitivity rather than sensible. Okay, sensitivity is more the romantic approach. Remember that I said this a little bit later on when we look at where Jane Austen's only surviving portrait is housed in the National Portrait Gallery. This is kind of a child's garden of classicism and romanticism, but they were two very, very important major philosophies, and again, Austen is really straddling the two. Pride and Prejudice, in many ways, can be seen almost as a refinement of Sense and Sensibility. And in Sense and Sensibility, one of the sisters, the older sister, represents sense. The younger sister represents sensibility. The younger sister very much into feelings, and she will emote in a public situation in a way that's considered extremely inappropriate behavior. By the time you see Pride and Prejudice, you see in one character, Elizabeth Bennet, in Pride and Prejudice, a happy balance, actually, of sense and sensibility. Of the two sisters in the earlier published work, become one character who has the feelings and the heart, but who also has the head and the reason, and takes a much more balanced approach and understands that there are social rules that must be followed, or negative consequences will result, not only for the woman, but also for her entire family. Okay, I had this image of Anne Hathaway from Being Jane, because in my mind, this image screams romanticism to me. I mean, doesn't it? Look, obviously, she's holding her bonnet. There's a wind. She's like wind blown. She's out on somewhere. I don't know if this is a building or on the moors or whatever, but she's holding the book. You know, the art, her book is important to her. And she just seems like she's really very much a romantic heroine, which I think is a bit of an exaggeration as to what Jane Austen was actually about in the novels. But I think the filmmakers were hoping to kind of, you know, sex Jane up a little bit and make her seem a little bit more like a romantic heroine. So, I don't know, sort of like Outlander. Is anybody watching Outlander? One of my current guilty pleasures. It's on Starz. It's about time travel, and it's in the Highlands, actually, so it's the same, roughly the same time period, mid-18th century, just a titch before Jane Austen is born. Total soap opera. Okay, what are some of the themes that are novels? Looking a little bit more closely at her novels. Friendship, family, gospel values, these are all important in all the novels across the board. There are lots and lots of examples of dysfunctional families, of family members who are greedy and selfish and disloyal. Okay? There are all kinds of examples of friends who are supposedly friends but who wind up being very deceiving and very much not what they appear to be. But the strong theme, despite all these bad examples, is the positive worth of friends and family, and very much faith, hope, charity, and the golden rule. The positive characters in Austen's novels really strive to follow the golden rule. Most of all, Austen is looking at people in society, at social relationships, and at why people behave the way they do in social interactions. This is what she is about. So all of her novels focus on this very particular social class of people and how they behave in society. She's extremely insightful with respect to human nature and why people do the things they do, what their motivations are. And in Austen's novels, you can find just as many people who are motivated by negative values like greed, particularly, as you can find examples of people who are motivated by positive values. So she very often is teaching very indirectly in a very ironic way. The opening line of Pride and Prejudice is one of the most famous lines in all of British literature. And it's ironic, okay? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. It's ironic because the person who really thinks that's true is Mrs. Bennet, who is one of the most foolish characters in the entire novel. So it's Austen working indirectly, working through irony. One thing you also have to note, though, in Austen is Mrs. Bennet turns out to be right, because the single men in possession of fortunes that you see in the novel, Bingley and Darcy, actually do wind up getting married at the end. So that problematizes the simple dismissal of that first sentence as ironic. Okay, here are some of the important dates in Jane Austen's life. This is a little bit of an exaggeration on the hated her mother, adored her sister, but only a little bit. We think she probably was not overly enamored of Mrs. Austen. The Austens were a very large family. Jane had 7 siblings. One of the contextual aspects to keep in mind, I think, when you read her is how big families really were the norm. One of her sisters-in-law died in childbirth with her 11th child at the age of 35 and basically was pregnant for the entire marriage, okay? And that was not an exception. That was not unusual. So when we're talking about what women's lives, were like, it was sobering. She was not the only sister-in-law who Jane saw die in childbirth. So, it's a very, very different time. She had an older sister Cassandra was 3 years older. They were pretty much inseparable. The other 6 siblings were all sons. She was the daughter of a clergyman. Probably most of their friends were clergy, in their own social circle. One of her brothers became a clergyman. 2 of her brothers joined the Navy and became admiral of the fleet, so rose very high in the Navy. And the other brother did very well also. Another brother who eventually became a banker and really was the guiding force behind getting her published, but he spent time in the militia. So she actually, out of her 6 brothers, 3 of them were in the military. 1 was a clergyman. 1 was developmentally disabled, and we don't really know what was wrong with him. But he was essentially given to a family in their village, and he spent his whole life apparently with that family. Apparently lived a fairly long life also, but we don't know exactly what was wrong with him. Again, thinking about what it was like to live in the time and what Jane Austen's life was like, with these 8 children, for every single one of them, what happened was the baby would be given to someone in the village to raise until he or she was a toddler, at which point the child would be given back to Mr. and Mrs. Austen. And this was apparently not unusual and not something that anybody raised their eyebrows at. The Austens would visit their children. It wasn't like they had nothing to do with them, but for that period of time, and I've got any parents in the audience? A couple parents probably at least, right? All right, well, you know what the infancy and the toddler stage is. It's a lot of work. And if you've got 8 of them all kind of stacked up, one every couple years, it could be pretty overwhelming. So, the Austen solution was to kind of ship the infant off, and then by the time the infant came back, he or she at least was, toddling around and starting to talk and was a little bit more of a person, I guess. So to us, it seems like, wow, is that weird? But, that was apparently done. At least by some of the families. And again, the families who could afford to do it. And then the families who took care of the children got paid. So that was income for them. Yeah. Well, it was probably, okay, we don't totally know. Let me say that first. We have little documentation. Unfortunately, the family started managing the brand almost immediately. And that's what I'm going to call it, okay? I mean, it was brand management to the nth degree, pretty much the second Jane died. Cassandra, her sister, burned most of her letters. There are fewer than 200 letters that survive, okay, right now. There are, the letters that do survive, most of them are fairly bland. Okay, you don't get a good sense of family dynamics, of her opinions about her neighbors. There's just a lot more that we don't know because of all those letters. And it wasn't just Cassandra. Other family members burned their letters from her also. The first memoir that came out was written by a family member, and it was very much spun in the direction that they wanted it spun, which was that Jane was pious and a woman of strong Christian faith and wouldn't hurt a fly and wouldn't say a bad word about anybody and was essentially perfect. That was the Jane Austen brand. Okay, within this context, however, we have enough evidence, enough negative remarks that Jane makes about her mother. She was apparently a hypochondriac, and she outlived her daughter by many, many years. So she was kind of an example of the person who's constantly complaining about her health, and in so doing seems to drive everybody else crazy and just keeps going on, even though from her point of view she's going to die any second. That's not what happens. So partly, I think Jane felt she was annoying. The family as a whole, they were great readers, they were great writers. Many of her siblings, they wrote poetry, they created their own plays, they put on theatricals, amateur theatricals in their homes. So they all were very, very articulate, very engaged in the mind, really, in a way that was not typical. But we think it was really, bottom line personality clash. Cassandra didn't seem to have the same issues with her mother that Jane did. So, yes. It's tempted to say that. It's very, tempting to say that. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in general, if you look at all the mothers in the novels, most of them are really pretty poor mothers. I mean, Mrs. Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility is a very nice person, but she doesn't try to rein, Mary Ann in at all. She's just like Mary Ann. And I think the film adaptation that I like the most of that novel is one that was done about 20 years ago. It's the one with Emma Thompson as Eleanor Dashwood, and it opens with the father has died, in the family, and everybody is like crying hysterically, and Eleanor is the only one who's trying to keep the household going, and the mother's out crying, and the two sisters are crying, and everybody's crying, and poor Eleanor is trying to run the household, and that should have been her mother doing that. But her mother just wasn't stepping up in the way that she should as a responsible parent. That's benign compared to Mrs. Bennet. So it's very tempting to say that, but honestly, we don't have the proof. We just don't. It's tempting to say that, Elizabeth Bennet is Jane Austen. That's tempting too, because Elizabeth Bennet is a very engaging character. Whether it's true is unfortunately not something that we have any evidence for. Jane was in fact somewhat unusually sent away to boarding school. The problem was she was like 7 and her sister was 10, and they went off with their little cousin, Jane Cooper. The conditions that they were sent to, these boarding schools, and it wasn't just this one, they were all pretty much appalling. The food was bad, there was no heat, just all the horrible things that you might think of as sort of a Charles Dickens type boarding school. It was all true. What happened in the event was that the 3 girls became extremely ill. The cousin's mother, the aunt, had to go fetch the 3 girls because there was a raging some type of flu or virus or bacteria or whatever. And remember, no antibiotics back then. If you're talking about lived experience, if you got any type of infection, you either got well or you didn't, but you didn't have any antibiotics. The aunt brought the 3 girls home. Jane nearly died, and the aunt did die. The 3 young girls fortunately survived, but the mother of one of them did not. A year later, she was sent to another boarding school for about a year, and then after that, both girls were brought home and stayed home and just studied from their father's library. He had a very extensive library for the time. He taught school. He actually ran his home as a school for boys. So on any given day, their home was filled with boys who were being instructed by Mr. Austen. And the daughters were welcome to read anything, which I think it's sort of a riot because you picture like the 12-year-old Jane Austen reading Tom Jones, right? Have you guys read Tom Jones? It's just probably not for, it's like R-rated anyway, I would say. But they were free to read whatever they wanted. So they did have an education, but it was very different. Another example of what schools were like back then, boarding schools, when they were at school the first time around, the school was in Oxford, which was not that far from where they lived. Well, in the middle of the year, the woman who owned the school decided to move it south to Southampton, which is right on the coast, and she just did it. She just moved the school. So there was quite a time, period there where the Austens actually didn't know where the girls were. And nobody thought anything of that. Eventually they found out that they were in Southampton, not in Oxford, but It was considered no big deal. So once again, I want to stress, what is the lived experience like? Well, it was a very different experience from, from our lives. We can't imagine that, let alone just kind of sending off a 7-year-old. When the girls got so sick, at one point we do have a surviving letter where Mrs. Austen basically justifies, rationalizes sending Jane along also, even though she was so much younger, by saying that, well, Jane always wanted to do whatever Cassandra wanted to do, and if Cassandra wanted her head chopped off, then Jane would want her head chopped off too. So it was like, don't look at me, I couldn't control. What? She's 7 years old. Of course you could control her if you wanted. So again, I think it was things like this, that lead us to think there was some dysfunction there in the mother-daughter relationship, really right from the start. Okay, Jane Austen wrote from early on. We do have examples of what's called juvenilia, writings that she did when she was very young. I have actually a facsimile edition of her History of England, and I forgot to bring it with me. But it's kind of a riot because she goes back to the first king of England and then goes through and just writes her own version of what happened in all these monarchs' reigns. And it's very funny. And if she didn't like a particular king or whatever, she just, left them out and just did her own thing. And again, you could see the wit. And I want to stress, all the Austens wrote. So it was not, it was not at all unusual. We talk about social network, social media and social networking now, and social networks. Well, believe me, they had them back then too. It's just that they were different. It was all face-to-face or letters. But the idea of a social network, a web of relationships, extremely important in Austen. These folks were always visiting each other. They were playing cards together. They were going to balls. They were traveling, as I said, especially after Mr. Austen, the Reverend Mr. Austen died. Jane and her mother traveled all around to various cousins' homes, brothers' homes. They were always visiting, always talking. And in the novels, the dialogue is absolutely incredible. And I think most of the really successful Austen adaptations have the good sense to retain as much of the dialogue as possible. It sparkles, and it's really, really good. 20 years ago, the BBC production of Pride and Prejudice that had Jennifer Ely as Elizabeth Bennet, and of course Colin Firth as the definitive Mr. Darcy, my opinion and most other opinions. That was a 6-hour TV production, okay? So in 6 hours, you can pretty much lift hook, line, and sinker conversations right from the book. And that's exactly what Andrew Davies, who was the scriptwriter, did. Andrew Davies is interesting, too, as a screenwriter. He doesn't actually like Jane Austen much because he thinks she focuses too much on women. So one of the things that he wanted to do in this adaptation was punch up the parts for the male actors. But fortunately, over 6 hours, he was also able to just throw in a lot of the original dialogue, which really, was a good idea. Okay, so also balls. Did I mention balls? Very, very important. And then I put in as the fourth bullet point here the idea of upstairs, downstairs, and that was also a very famous TV series on PBS back in I think it was back in the 70s, and it's really long. There are, I don't know, 75 episodes, something like that. But the idea of the upstairs, downstairs is the upstairs was where the family lived, and invited people over for tea, and if they had a big enough house, had the balls and interacted with all their guests. And then the downstairs piece was the infrastructure, the servants that made everything else run. And sometimes the series focused on the upstairs, and sometimes it focused on downstairs. And in Austen's novels, the upstairs network is what we see most often. So we see the gentry in all these social situations. But we also know from references in the novels that there was very distinctly a downstairs network. Very often, information in the novels is passed among families through the servants. So one cook will know another cook in another family, or one upstairs parlor maid will know the upstairs parlor maid in the next estate, down the road or whatever, and they'll talk about what their masters are up to. So there's definitely an exchange of information that passes through the servant class as much as the upstairs class. And in the final novel that Jane Austen wrote, one of the characters in the novel is actually not a member of the gentry. She's a gentlewoman, a widow, whose husband got into lots of financial difficulties, and that's kind of a subplot in this novel, which is called Persuasion. But one of the important characters actually in that novel is a very minor character who's the nurse of the woman, the widow, and she actually has a name. She's called Nurse Rook. In that novel, she's one of the few servants who has a name, and she's a conduit for very important information for the upstairs folks to have. So there very much was, like I said, this web of social relationships, and because families were large, that meant there was a large network of cousins, first cousins, second cousins, whatever. Okay, I'm just going to kind of whiz through this. After Jane Austen's father died, okay, eventually one of her brothers, who was very, very wealthy because he was adopted by a wealthy family, let his mother, Cassandra, Jane, and an unmarried female friend of theirs, Martha Lloyd, live in what they called Chon Cottage. And you can tell that I took this photo because there's this poor woman whose butt is here. Oh well. But I took the photo and then I got it back home and there she was. So she's in there because I always want people to see the whole house. This is Chon Cottage, quote unquote. Now, this pretty much isn't my idea really of a cottage. I tend to think of a cottage as being a wee bit smaller. This had 6 or 7 bedrooms, and Jane Austen's brother Edward permitted them to begin living in this home in 1809. Between 1805 and 1809, basically they were traveling around to live with different relatives. They had some rented houses in Bath during that 4-year time period. But in 1809, Edward and the other brothers too stepped up, and they each pooled money, and in the case of at least one of the brothers, the clergyman, he didn't really have a lot of money, so it was kind of a financial hardship for him to do it, but he did the right thing, and they put together enough money so the mother, the 2 sisters, and the unmarried friend of the family could all live together. Again, lived experience. The women were completely dependent on men for support, financial support, unless specifically provided for in a will. Now, Cassandra had a tiny bit of money of her own every year because one of her friends who was wealthy specifically provided for her in her will. Mrs. Austen actually had, of all things, property in the South Seas that provided some income. Otherwise, Blanche Dubois says she's dependent on the kindness of strangers in Tennessee Williams. Well, they weren't dependent on the kindness of strangers, but they sure were dependent on the kindness of their male relatives. And I'm just going to kind of zoom through these. These are just some views of what it was like. There were outbuildings. Okay, the main kitchen, the bakery, if you will, for the house wasn't part of the house. Now, again, we're thinking about the lived experience. If a house caught fire, you couldn't just have the fire alarm ring at the fire station. Okay, so having an outbuilding where you did most of the baking and therefore had most of the fire was actually a good thing, because then if that building burned down, you'd have a fighting chance of having the fire not spreading to the main house. And of course the outbuildings were here. This is also another one of my photographs where, when I finally took a better look, there are my feet and legs, because I was taking the photo behind a glass case and I had the reflection. But the reason that I took this is we only have one surviving handwritten manuscript, and this is it. At the time that I took this photo, I was with a student group, and we had gone to the British Library, and specifically I wanted them to see this handwritten manuscript. So we get to the library, and we got to the appropriate room in the display case, and there was this little card that said, on loan. And so, at that point, I'm like, really? Like 3,500 miles or 3,700 miles or however far away the British Library is from Cleveland, Ohio, and there we are, and it's on loan? So for about 2 seconds, I thought of going, full ugly American and just like pitching a fit and saying that I was a U.S. citizen and they better cough up with that manuscript because we came here to see it, by God. But I came to my senses. So we went to Chon Cottage, walked in, and the first thing that we saw was the manuscript. It was on loan to Chon Cottage. So then I started, doing my joy dance, and then the students were kind of going, look at Dr. POTUS, isn't that cute? She's so excited. But I was, because again, it's one. That's all we had. I said we have very little documentation. It would be wonderful to have more handwritten manuscripts. It would be fabulous to have different versions. What do these novels look like before they were published? What was the first draft like? But we really don't have any of that. But we do have one surviving. Chon Cottage Gardens, they are trying very hard to restore in the 18th century style. And part of the gardens provided plants that could be used for dyes, for instance. All right, Jane Austen is arguably, one of the best novelists ever in English, okay? She sewed her brother's shirts. She made breakfast every morning for the family. She did all this domestic stuff, okay, including raising plants so that they could dye their clothing. And this is just more gardens. At just a really short walk away from Chon Cottage is St. Nicholas Churchyard, and that's where Jane Austen's mother and sister were both buried. And I always say this, and I say, okay, maybe next time I won't say it, but then I do anyway. One of her brothers died at 91, and Cassandra lived into her 80s, and most of the rest of the family lived into their 80s, and Jane Austen has to go and die at 42, and I just think that's so unfair. But there you have it. And this is just from St. Nicholas. Okay, she is actually the last person to be buried in Winchester Cathedral. All right, she moved into the Chon Cottage in 1809. She started feeling not so great somewhere around 1814, 1815. We don't know what she died of. She may have had Addison's disease, which today is very treatable. May have been Addison's disease. She may have had lymphoma. We just don't know. We know from the few letters here and there references to her symptoms, but not enough really to make a definitive diagnosis. And she was moved to Winchester, taken from that little house in Chawton. Her brother lived in this gigantic house just down the road. She moved from the little house in Chawton to Winchester to get a better doctor. Okay, but the doctor was unable to save her. Winchester is just an incredible cathedral. It's Norman. It was consecrated in 1093. History majors, the Norman conquest was in... Yes, Very good, very good. Okay, so 1066, the Normans conquer England and very quickly started building cathedrals, and Winchester is one of them. It has the longest uninterrupted nave of any Gothic cathedral in Europe, and it's essentially the length of a football field. I don't know that, that this really does it justice. There are no side altars or chapels or anything disturbing the flow. So when you walk in, you set foot in, and literally it's a 100-yard straight shot to the altar. It's extremely impressive. It's huge. I have a website that has a video, but I don't know that we'll be able to look at it. Jane Austen is buried there in the cathedral, and if you've been abroad and you've been to cathedrals where folks are buried in them, you know they're usually, if they're not in a crypt, you know, underneath, they're underneath the floor, and they're just grave markers. So you kind of walk along, and you see where, you know, who's buried where, and this is the marker in the cathedral, and you can see behind it that there are other people buried there as well. The day that we were there, we wanted to explore a lot more, but unfortunately a prominent citizen had died a couple days before, and there was a funeral coming in, and we had to clear out. Once again, I mean, really, you know, we come 3,700 miles, and there has to be, but anyway. Okay, this is the text of the marker, and you can read that, right? Somebody want to read it? Would you mind reading it out loud? If you can, somebody who's got it. Anybody volunteer reader? Everybody bashful. There are no hard words in it, I don't think.
In memory of Jane Austen, youngest daughter of the late Reverend George Austen, formerly rector of Steventon in this county. She departed this life on the 18th of July, 1817, aged 41, after a long illness, poor education, and the hopes of a Christian. The benevolence of her heart, the sweetness of her temper, and the extraordinary endowments of her mind, but the peace and regard of all who knew her, and the warmest love of her intimate connections. Their grief is in proportion to their affection. They knew their loss to be irreparable, but in their deepest affliction, they are consoled by a firm, though humble hope, that her charity, devotion, faith, and purity have rendered her soul acceptable in the sight of God.
Okay, is there anything left out here?
But she was not.
Yeah, right? And if you look closely at the grave marker, a couple of other things from a design standpoint leap out at you. Her name is actually in smaller font than her father's name. All right, and notice she's immediately identified as daughter of the late Reverend George Austen. And then all of the references to her Christian piety. And again, this is brand management. It's Austen family brand management. There is an Austen brand that they embraced and were very intentional about that continued all through the rest of the 19th century. Here's her obituary. Someone want to read this? This is shorter. And this is from the Winchester Journal or something. Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
On Friday the 18th,
Yeah, that just means the most recent. Yeah.
died in the city is Jane Austen, youngest daughter of the late Reverend George Austen, rector of Steventon in this county, and the authoress of Emma, Master of Art, Pride and Prejudice, and Sensibility. Her manner was most gentle, her affections ardent. Her candor was not to be suppressed, and she lived and died as became a humble person.
Yeah. Okay, so at least here we know that she is a writer. I always crack up when I see the idea of her being the authoress. And I've got a little story to tell you, lest you think that, things have changed all that much. But about, 25 or 30 years ago, when I was appointed a division director of arts and sciences, one of the older faculty sort of sniffed and said, "Oh, so you're the directress. And I just really didn't know what to say at that point. I'm like, no, I'm not the director-S, I'm the director. But anyway, so at least here we do have references to her as, in fact, a writer. Okay, so this was toward the end of the month. Remember, she died earlier in the month, in July. Then later, there was a brass plate that was added. So the grave is in the floor, the grave marker is in the floor, and then over to the right, there's a brass plate on the wall of the cathedral, and there's a place to leave flowers, and you know how in the European churches there are always ladies who do the flowers in the little villages, and they still do that. So there's a place to put flowers and a brass plate. This is what it says. Volunteer reader again, please.
Jane Austen, known to many by her writings, endeared to her family by the varied charms of her character, and ennobled by the Christian faith and piety, was born at Steventon in the county of, I can't remember.
It says Hants, but it's Hampshire. That's an abbreviation for Hampshire, yeah.
December 16, 1775, and buried in the cathedral July 18, 1817. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness.
And that is Proverbs.
Loud, younger people.
And that's Proverbs 31:26 for anybody who's interested and can't come up with it. I had to Google it, full disclosure. So we're kind of back to the same theme, though, right? And this was done in the 1870s. The obituary and the grave marker were both written by her brother, Henry Austen. And the brass plate in the 1870s was also by a family member. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. I'm going to read you a passage from the last novel that she wrote, Persuasion. Okay? And I hope to do it justice here. This is the circumstance. In that novel, there are two young daughters, one of whom is hoping to be engaged to Captain Wentworth, who is kind of the hero of the novel. And remember I said that Jane Austen had two brothers who were in the Navy? By all that we have available to us, which granted is not much, she really loved her brothers, and she was extremely proud of them. She was very proud that one became Admiral of the Fleet, for instance, and she was proud of both of them. So she really liked the Navy, and Captain Wentworth in that novel is a very positive figure. So one of these young ladies, the older sister, is hoping to become engaged to him, and the younger sister is hoping to become engaged to another Navy captain, okay, in the novel. And they're all walking along the beach, and there's a rather large wall that you can walk on top of, or you can walk down on the beach. And what the one sister, the older sister, who's sort of like Mary Ann Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. She's very impulsive, and she's very spur of the moment, very spontaneous. She's walking along the top, and she gets it into her head, isn't it a good idea if I jump? And it's maybe, 8 or 10 feet, jump, and Captain Wentworth will catch me. Okay, and again, this is we're talking lived experience. This is at a time when young ladies and gentlemen basically couldn't touch each other unless they were dancing. So having her jump off the wall gives her the opportunity to be in his arms, right? Even if it's just for a second. So it's kind of a way of getting around the rules of propriety. So at one point, what happens is she jumps off once or twice, and everything is fine, and Wentworth catches her. But then she says, I want to do this again. And Wentworth is saying, no, this is enough, let's move on. She says, no. And she runs up the stairs, and she just jumps. And he's not ready to catch her, so she hits the ground, right? She gets knocked out. The sister just gets hysterical. The main character in the novel, Anne Elliot, who is older than these two women, is kind of like Elizabeth Bennet or Elizabeth Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. She's the only one with any sense. She's the one who has the presence of mind to say, get the doctor. She manages to keep everybody calm. The other younger sister faints. Okay, so you've got the one sister who's out cold because she fell. The other sister faints because she sees her sister out cold. This is what Jane Austen says, though, the narrative voice. By this time, the report of the accident had spread among the workmen and the boatmen, and many were collected near them, to be useful if wanted, at any rate, to enjoy the sight of a dead young lady, nay, 2 dead young ladies, for it proved twice as fine as the first report. To some of the best looking of these good people, Henrietta was consigned. Now think about it. Okay, what kind of comment is that about human nature? Okay, that they're coming to enjoy the sight of a dead young lady, nay, 2 dead young ladies, for it proved twice as fine as the first report. Now this sounds to me like what happens pretty much on a daily basis when there's a wreck on the freeway and everybody slows down to look, right? It's a very cynical view of human nature, and you kind of put that together with she openeth her mouth with wisdom and in her tongue is the law of kindness. This is in no way a kind remark. It's a cynical remark, it's a biting remark, and it's only one of many examples that you can find of a similar voice. So again, I would say we're talking brand management and the idea of this very demure, very mousy, very much pious woman is something that while not a fiction, is probably not all there is to the story. And this is that plate that I mentioned, and you can see the day that we were there was a gorgeous floral arrangement, which is changed a couple times a week. She died in this home in Winchester, probably in that room on the second story that has the bow window. It's in private hands, so you can't actually go into it. So what happens is you get little clumps of tourists standing across the street taking pictures of it, which must be annoying if you actually live there. They do, of course, have one of these blue plates, and in the UK, the blue plates are everywhere, and they always indicate, basically, like we would say, George Washington slept here. Well, it'll be Mary Queen of Scots, or whoever, always on a blue plate. And my favorite blue plate was in central London. We were staying around the corner from a house that had this blue plate, and what the blue plate said was it gave the dates, and I forget what the dates were, maybe like 1801 to 1803, whatever. Here lived Benedict Arnold, patriot. And I just thought that was pretty hilarious. And at first, when I saw it, it didn't register, and I thought, wait a minute. But just like capturing the ships, I mean, if the flag that's flying is a country that you're at war with, you're not a pirate, you're doing the right thing. So, Benedict Arnold was as well. One of the other frustrating things about Jane Austen and her life is that we don't have any portraits of her. If you go to Chon Cottage right now, there's a life-size oil painting of her brother. Okay, it's the rich brother who let her live in the house, and that was really, really nice of him, but it would have been great if there had been even one painting by a professional artist of Jane Austen, and there's none. There are paintings of her brother. There's a photo of her brother, the Admiral, because he lived until the age of 91, and there were cameras already. So we've got a photo of him. We've got Diddley for Jane Austen. What we do have is this drawing, which was done by her sister. Now remember I said that I would have been basically crap in the 18th century as a gentlewoman because I couldn't draw at all. I guarantee you, if somebody had me draw somebody, my drawing would not look anything like the person. It probably wouldn't look like a person actually at all. So, does this really look like Jane Austen? Who knows? Here and there we've got snippets and other letters that talk about her dark eyes, that talk about her dark hair. Maybe this looks like her. We've got a letter from one of her nieces who says, oh, it doesn't really do her justice. We don't know. But it's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It's this is the okay. There's this was hand drawn by Cassandra. Then in the 1870s, there was an engraving made by a professional artist based on this drawing, and that engraving is going to be on the 10-pound note, which is pretty cool because the only other female who's on British currency right now is the Queen. So Charles Darwin is kicked to the curb, and Jane Austen will be on the 10-pound note, kind of based on this portrait. She's in Gallery 18, and I'm just going to mention that we could go to the website, but it'll probably take too long. When you walk into the room, it's a room a little bit smaller than the space that we're in right now. It's covered with gigantic oil paintings, really, really big ones. This drawing of Jane is a miniature. It's like 3.5 inches by 4 3/4 inches. It's pretty small, but it's in its own little plexiglass case, and it's got lights on it, so your attention is drawn to it, even though it's small. The neat thing, though, is that it's not all males in this gallery. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin is in the room, along with her husband William Godwin and their daughter Mary Godwin Shelley. And Mary Wollstonecraft died giving birth to Mary Shelley, so it's like this family by portraiture is together in one place in art in a way that they never were in life. It's tempting to wonder whether Jane Austen read A Vindication of the Rights of Women. That was published in 1792. Again, it's tempting to say, well, she was born in 1775. Okay, so, and had been reading everything in her father's library since she was a small child, since she learned to read. It's tempting to say she must have read it. It's tempting to say, oh, I bet she really liked it. On the other hand, we don't really know. The text starts out with an attack on the monarchy. It goes on to attack the army, the navy, the clergy. And again, remember, Jane Austen had a brother in the militia. She had 2 brothers in the navy. She had 1 brother and a father who were clergymen, and most of their male friends were clergy. So who knows what she would have made of it. On the other hand, what you can also say, we were talking about mothers earlier in the novels and saying how many of them were dysfunctional, how many of them were just plain mean, greedy, nasty, whatever, silly, foolish. Very few examples of what we would consider really positive mothers in the novels. You could say exactly the same thing about the clergy. Okay, the clergy just come into some real hits in Jane Austen. So, when you read about the Reverend Collins in Pride and Prejudice, or, Reverend Elton in Sense and Sensibility, it's kind of tempting, like, to make this jump and say, oh my God, that must have been what her father was like, or they must have had all these friends that were like that. I mean, who knows? We don't know and we'll never know. But it's tempting to say, well, Jane Austen, despite the fact that she had blood relations in particular professions, must have been astute enough, because she was a very, very astute student of human nature. She must have known that, like any other profession, you can have, corrupt clergymen, soldiers, whatever. I also wanted to mention one final thing here, so please bear with me. We tend to think of novels as something that have always been with us, like, Death and Taxes or whatever, novels that, we read novels or we don't read novels, but they've always been around. One thing that I think is useful to bear in mind when you're thinking about Jane Austen is that the novel as a genre was extremely new at that point. Okay, and so the fact that she was writing novels at all is really pretty amazing, because it's not like poetry where, you can go back to Beowulf, right, which was written in whenever it was written, 600, 700, whatever, do we know? It was Old English, so we know it was probably somewhere between, 500 and 1,000, something like that. Centuries earlier. Poetry in English, let alone, classical poetry. The theater, drama, very, very old genre, but not the novel. The novel was new. The novel only appeared in the middle of the 18th century. So, it's pretty amazing. And as you look at her novels, Persuasion, which was published posthumously and was the final published novel that she wrote just before her death, finished just before her death, is written in a style that's a bit different from the earlier ones, and it has much more what we would tend to associate with novels later in the century, because the main character in that novel, Anne Elliot, has, let's see, there's a lot of you get to know what's in Anne's mind in a way that you don't in some of the earlier novels, where you're relying on what the character says or does to know what the character is thinking. In Persuasion, you're in Anne's mind and seeing things and feeling things from her point of view a lot, and it has a whole different feel to it. It's a wonderful novel. It's over the years that it really is my favorite. What I wanted to mention here, though, was this. From the time that Jane Austen started writing Sense and Sensibility to this publication date, 13 years. For Pride and Prejudice, 18 years. For Northanger Abbey, 20 years. Again, when we think of novels and people writing novels today, we tend to think of, a writer sitting down, knocking out a novel. It's good. He gets publisher. She gets publisher. Poof, 6 months later, a year later, whatever, there's the novel. We go and we buy it, blah, blah, blah. That's not at all what was happening at this time. A lot of this, I think, is a function of the fact that she was a woman. Her brother Henry really helped her out. He was a banker in London, and he was the one who really tried to get her manuscripts sold. In some cases, in Northanger Abbey, it was published in one volume with Persuasion just after she died. By the end of 1817, those two novels were published in one volume. But they had sold, Henry had actually sold Northanger Abbey, the manuscript, in 1803 to a publisher who shilly-shallied around, and they sold it for like 10 pounds, and then Jane didn't have any money because, again, she really didn't have money. She had to depend on, what her family members gave her, and she certainly wasn't going to ask them for 10 pounds to buy the rights back. So it wasn't until they could finally scrape up the 10 pounds to buy it back that then ultimately it was published. So partly this lag time is because, I think, because she is a woman, and also because okay, remember her dates again, 1775, 1817. She did a lot of writing in the 1790s when she was very, very young. Okay, and then in 1800, her father died, and the family had to move to Bath, and then also started wandering around, going to cousins and brothers and everybody else. So she didn't really have a place to write, a place of her own to write. Okay, and for probably between about 1800 and 1809, she wrote either very little or nothing at all. And then between 1809 and 1817, everything kicked into gear. She got the earlier novels published. She wrote Mansfield Park. She wrote Emma. She wrote Persuasion. She was working on a couple other things. So that's basically a little bit about what her lived experience was like, we think. Any questions? Thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you.